Hi everyone, welcome to this week's lunchtime lesson. Today we're going to be talking about modal verbs of obligation. So the first thing to talk about, I think, is what on earth is a modal verb? Yeah, you might be wondering. So a modal verb is essentially a special type of verb, and it changes or affects the other verbs which are in a sentence. It gives an extra meaning. And they're used to show the level of possibility or to indicate ability or to show obligation or give permission. Yeah, so they have lots of different functions. And they also behave differently to what we would call an ordinary verb. Yeah, the way that they're positioned and what they do. But here is where I really want you to think a little bit differently, everyone, from what you have probably read in your course books. So if you've studied modal verbs before, it's usually presented as grammar, okay? And today, I don't want us to think about this as grammar. Yeah, we're going to think about it instead of as grammar, we're going to think about it as vocabulary. And I think this is a good way to approach a lot of English, which is usually taught as grammar. Yeah, if we think about it as vocabulary, then we can think more about the function that structure is doing and what it's allowing you to express, okay, rather than thinking about how you should be constructing it. And that's how you're ultimately going to be able to use English properly and fluently. So the way I want you to think of it is a modal verb is a bit like a paintbrush. Yeah, you're going to dip it in different colors and you're going to use it to paint your sentence with a different meaning and with a new meaning. And that's what's so amazing about modal verbs and how powerful they are. And that's really why I think it's better to think about them as vocabulary. So to give you an example of that, if I have the sentence, I call my mother, yeah? If I want to express that there's an obligation for me to call her, I will add a modal verb, okay? Could anyone think of what modal verb we could use? Put it in the chat box for me. Okay, we've got must, we've got should. Yeah, a couple of options. So, we could say if we're expressing an important obligation, yeah, we could use I must, or I have to, or I need to call my mother, yeah? Now, if I wanted to say that it's a good idea to call my mother, but there won't be the same consequences, what modal verb could I use? Okay, so Monica's putting may and might. So may and might won't express obligation. Those are modal verbs that we use for speculation or deduction. I want one to say that, you know, it's a good idea, but if I don't, it's okay. So could will talk about ability, not obligation. Should, well done, Natya. So I should, or I can also say I ought to call my mother. So what these modal verbs have done have painted your sentence with this idea of obligation or something which is a good idea or gives advice. Yeah. Now, the most important thing with all language, right, but especially today we're talking about modal verbs. So the most important thing is context, right? Your context is key. Modal verbs will change depending on the context that they are seen in, okay? So if I say I must call my mother, there I'm expressing obligation. But if I say my mother must be busy, she isn't answering the phone, there I'm actually expressing deduction or speculation. So we are going to focus today on how we're using these verbs for obligation only, but we will have a look in another session about how we can use them for deduction and speculation. So don't worry, we will come to that. Now, we also have this word called semimodals, right? And we've actually seen a couple of examples already of semimodals. So a semimodal, they're not what we would call a proper modal. A proper modal always has to be followed by a bare infinitive. So a bare infinitive means that you never use to, right? I must go. Yeah, I never say I must to go. This is a really common error. And it's a normal error, as we'll see in a second. And when we're talking about modals of obligation, I can't change it into the past tense. So I can't say I musted. Okay. However, a semi-modal, it will give you the same function as a proper modal like must in terms of obligation, but we can follow it with to, or we need to follow it with to, and it can also be used in the past tense. So for example, I have to go, we'll always use the to here, and I can also put it into the past and say I had to go. If we're talking about the past, this is particularly important, and we'll come back to this in a second, guys, okay? Right, so I'm going to give you 1 minute, and I want you to write down, don't put them in the chat box, you can just write it for yourself personally. Write down as many modals or semi-modals of obligation that you can think of, okay? So 1 minute to write them down. On you go. Right, let's see if how many you got that are on my list. So we had must, of course, at the top, and then we have this other big long list. We're going to organize them in a second. Okay, so have a look at that. See how many you had on your list. And again, if you wrote down might or may, those are not modals of obligation. Yeah. So we don't want to talk about those today. Okay, now I would like you, please, to organize these on a scale. Up at the top, where there's 100% obligation, think about which verbs you would include, okay? And then in the middle and at the bottom, right? So they can be on various levels of the scale, yeah? So take another second. Think about in terms of when there's consequences to your obligation, they have to go up here. If it's advisable, it needs to go here. And if there isn't going to be a consequence to that action, it needs to go down here. Okay, so let's have a look at our answers. Right, so at the top here, where there is a consequence, we have must, mustn't, have to, need to, can't, and be allowed to. Yeah, and you'll see that we've got quite a list, a mix there of modals and semi-modals. In the middle, when it's advisable to do something, we have should or shouldn't, and ought to or ought not to. And then down here at the bottom, where there's no consequence, we have don't have to and don't need to. Okay. Now, please remember, it's only the semi-modals that we can use with a past aspect. Yeah. There's an exception to that, which is should, and I'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, but the others can't be used in the past. So I can't say I musted wear a uniform when I was at school. I need to say I had to, or I needed to wear a uniform when I was at school. Okay. All right, so some key points, and this is where I hear my students very often making errors. Yeah. Like we said, there is no past tense of must when we're talking about obligation. So if you're speaking in the past, we need to use had to or needed to. Please be careful with negatives. This is a really common error. So the sorry, let me go back again. I'm getting ahead of myself. Please be careful with negatives. Yeah. So what I mean by that is the opposite of must in terms of obligation is not mustn't, right? So must and mustn't are equal in terms of obligation. There are consequences. If I say you must pay your taxes, if you don't, you'll go to prison, there's a consequence. And if I say you mustn't kill someone, you'll go to prison, there's also a consequence. Okay? So just because a modal verb is in the negative, it doesn't make it an opposite in terms of intensity. Yeah. Okay. Now, need to is very often used instead of must or have to. And I recommend trying to bring that into your vocabulary because, again, I don't hear students use it very often. And if you listen to native or proficient speakers, it's something that they use all the time. Can't or not allowed equally are very often used instead of mustn't, okay, and are more commonly used too. Now, should, like I said before, we can use this with a past aspect, and I can form that with following it with have and the participle. So for example, I should have called my mother, okay? I didn't, but it would have been advisable if I did. The important thing about that, if you're using should in this structure, yeah, is the pronunciation. So we're going to contract the verb have because it's an auxiliary verb here and it's not important for the meaning we want to communicate. So because it's not an important word, we're going to change the vowel sound from a to the schwa, to and this is going to contract and become one block of sound. Okay, so I should have called my mother will change into I should have called. Okay, should have called. I should have called my mother. All right. When we talk about our modal verbs of deduction, we're going to do a lot more work with this pronunciation. And another thing that I hear a lot with should is students using it incorrectly. So remember, if there is a consequence, you need to use a modal or a semimodal, which is strong in terms of obligation. So see how many you can remember. We just looked at about 4 or 5, I think. If you write them in the chat box, what are good modals to talk about strong obligation? Okay, Manushka's got must, yeah, have to, good, have to. Can you remember some of the ones which weren't so common? Need to, good, Monica. And there was 2 more we talked about. Be allowed to, yep. And can't, well done. Now, I think somebody wrote should. Should is not one for strong obligation, okay? So if it's a good idea, or if something is advisable, or I am giving you advice, which modal should I use? Write it in the chat box. Well done. Here we're using should, okay? I can also use ought to, yeah? So the difference that we've got here is one of register. And this is another important thing for modals in general that people tend to have problems with. If you look in a grammar book, and I'm putting this grammatical thing in inverted commas because it's not always the most natural way to express things. The grammatical reason when we should choose between must or have to is to do with personal or internal obligations or external. So a grammar book will tell you that must is used for internal obligations and have to is for external obligations. Like, I must call my mother. That's something I need to do, but I have to go to work because that's what somebody else is making me do. But I really disagree with that. I think must is more formal. And when you're using it in your speech, it sounds much more serious. Yeah. So I would recommend, instead of using must, trying to use have to when you're speaking. The same with ought to and should. Yeah, ought to is a more formal way to express something that is advisable than should. And we also have this one here, have got to. And have got to is the same as have to, but it's more informal and it's more commonly used in spoken English as well. But in terms of how strong it is, there's no difference in meaning. Okay, so we're going to test ourselves again and see how much you can remember. So we had a big collection of modal verbs that we wrote down before. Let's do it again. Take another minute. See if you can remember more than you wrote the first time. Okay, go. So these were the ones that we had, okay? And we're going to see if we can put them correctly on the scale. So let's see if we got these correct. So at the top, we should have had must, mustn't, have to, need to, can't, and be allowed to. Yeah. In the middle, we had should or shouldn't and ought to or ought not to. And then down at the bottom, we had don't have to, don't need to. Yeah, because there aren't any consequences. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and hopefully see you next week. Bye.